The financial inequality across the globe has reached new extremes. International charity Oxfam, in its latest report, An Economy for the 1%, has a shocking revelation. Runaway inequality has created a world where 62 people own as much wealth as the poorest half of the world's population. Imagine that. Only 5 years earlier, it took 388 of the world's richest to reach that mark. Extreme inequality, that is the topic for this edition of the debate.
An economy for the 1%. That's how a new report by the Oxfam charity organization has described the growing global inequality between the haves and the have-nots. The report, which was released on Monday, highlights stark differences between the poor and the rich. Let's take a look at some of the report's facts and figures. The richest 1% own more than all the rest of all people. In 2015, 62 individuals had the same wealth as 3.6 billion people. The wealth of the richest 62 people increased by $500 billion between 2010 and 2015. The wealth of the bottom half fell by over $1 trillion in the same period. The numbers are startling. The majority of the world's richest 1% are white and come from North America and Europe. Oxfam has also highlighted the role of tax havens and the growing disparity between the rich and the poor. Back in 2011, the U.S. was rocked by the Occupy Wall Street protest movement. Their slogan, "We're the 99%. The protesters were angry over income and wealth inequality in the United States and the concentration of wealth among the top 1%. Analysts believe the protest movement managed to raise global awareness about wealth inequality in different parts of the world.
I think there is already many signs of this disruption and protests of people, whether it was Occupy in the United States that started 5 years ago and spread around the world as an idea against the 1%. That was just a glimpse of what will take place. There are protests everywhere, from farmers, peasants demanding the right to use their land and not have their land used for biofuels.
World leaders, bankers, and rich billionaires are now preparing to attend the World Economic Forum in the Swiss city of Davos. The Oxfam report has raised questions about the global capitalist system, led by the U.S. and other Western countries. So will the report persuade those in power to change their policies? Or should we expect more protests and grassroots movements in the future against the widening gap?
Our guest for this edition of the debate, author of Bank to the Future, Simon Dixon, joins us from London. And we have columnist at The Hill, Brent Badowski, who joins us from Washington. Gentlemen, welcome. Simon Dixon, starting off with you. Perhaps you can shed light on this finding that says 62 people own as much wealth as the poorest half of the world's population. Put that into perspective for us, if you can, please.
Sure. Well, it's a shocking statistic, but not really as shocking when you think about the policies that have gone in the world of finance over the last few years. So this is the end of trillions and trillions being moved into quantitative easing. The quantitative easing has actually taken taxpayers' money, government assets, and ginormous forms of wealth, and put it in the hands of the largest corporates in propping up banks, and essentially allowing access to cheap credit for the wealthiest people in the world. And so if the policy was slightly different, if the policy was that the quantitative easing money was used in order to give some kind of tax credit to everyday people and poorer people, then we would have actually had a re-stimulus of the economy and less inequality. But because the quantitative easing money was used to lend money to the richest, the wealthiest, the banks, the large corporates at virtually 0% interest, while the poorest people have to go out and get payday loans at more 20 to 30% interest, then you're going to see a big redistribution, as we have seen. And because trillions was put through quantitative easing, we're now seeing shocking statistics, as we've seen recently in the Oxfam report. Okay,
so there you had some technical pieces put into this explanation, Brent Badowski. But, you know, if we want to take a look at the issue of wealth inequality, it has been a pressing issue that has been rearing its ugly head around the world. and in particular in Europe and the United States. Why do you think that this inequality keeps persisting and increasing, widening the gap?
Well, the system is fixed. The game is rigged. It's in favor of the big banks, in favor of Wall Street firms, in favor of the super wealthy, and against the poor and against average folks in the middle class and workers. The biggest issue in American politics right now in recent days, fortunately, is Bernie Sanders raising the issue of income inequality in the presidential campaign. I think that's very important. Hillary Clinton is okay on those issues. Bernie Sanders is fantastic on those issues and putting pressure on her and on Republicans on this. But we won't persuade the powers that be to change voluntarily. In America, through elections, and in Europe, we need to change the powers that be and get people in who will force those change with the people supporting them. It's a battle of ideas and a battle of equality and justice. I supported and support Occupy Wall Street. I'm a devout believer in Pope Francis for my personal faith and for his teachings. And I think people around the world, people in the United States and Europe, people in every democratic country need to demand that their leaders change their policies and build a more just and equal economy.
Well, when you talk about Occupy Wall Street, and of course when we take a look at so many repeated statements, Simon Dixon, that have been made regarding inequality, one of the things that keeps popping up are corporations and banks. They seem to be in the forefront of have taken over in one way or another, whether it's the governments or to be a leading contributor to not having the wealth be spread and for it to trickle down. Now I'm taking a look at this one particular fact, since you're in London, and that's about the rich list when it came out in 2015, the UK rich list. And what's interesting about that is that the super rich, as it says here, well, there now have to be 100 million pounds to be in the top 1,000. Back in 97, it just took 15 million pounds to make that grade. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so the numbers are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, as we've heard from this Oxfam report. The actual number one asset class, and particularly in London and areas like London, is that it has such a reliance upon property. And property is really one of those games that also contributes to a massive rich-poor divide, because it's really the people that can afford assets and the people that can get on the property ladder and the people that own property in London are those 1% people. And property has become an asset class which is propped up by banks, propped up by lending, propped up by quantitative easing, and protected at all costs by governments. Now, what the property market actually does is, because it continually rises, especially in areas like London, is it's a confiscation of wealth from those who don't have assets to those who do have assets. And by continually propping up the prices, by continually relying on mortgage debt and the mortgage market, and 40% of all loans at banks going to the mortgage market rather than making their way into small to medium-sized business, you get a ginormous wealth divide effect. And this is also happening on a global scale, because you've got to remember that most of the properties in London, many of the properties, the mega expensive ones, are owned by Chinese investors that are looking for an offshore place to put their money. Okay.
Brent Badowski, when people look at people who have money, in no matter what country, and if those people are in power, whether they're lawmakers or congressmen, for example, they always say, well, they are in power because they have money. And I'm going to use the United States as an example. When a few years back, half the members of Congress were declared to be millionaires. Now, there's something wrong when you have all the upper echelon to be in that position, especially lawmakers. And my point being is that doesn't this then sway decision making when it comes to people who are in positions when they have wealth and they don't really know what the people at the bottom are feeling?
Oh, that's definitely true. And it's even more true that certainly in America, the people who give money to the politicians, the billionaires who put money into the super PACs, the people who make campaign donations, the people who hire lobbyists and lawyers in America. You basically have mega billionaire companies and lobbyists supported by them, super PACs supported by mega billionaires, telling millionaire congressmen and senators what they should do. That's what I mean when I say that the whole system is rigged. The Supreme Court of the United States, in one of the worst decisions in the history of the law, literally legalized buying elections in a case called Citizens United, which we have to reverse. It's outrageous. So when you have people with above average income serving in Congress, receiving money from the richest people in the world and the richest companies in the world, the product is going to be bad. Now, what has to happen and has begun to happen is the rest of us have to fight back. That's why when Bernie Sanders is running for president and getting his money from the average people in $10 and $20, he raised as much money as any of the other candidates virtually, from average folks, not from billionaires, not from super PACs, and not from lobbyists. But when the system involves a Supreme Court that lets the rich buy elections, then the rich use money to buy elections, then they elect above average income members of Congress, you're guaranteed to get a bad result, and that's something we need to change urgently, now, and soon.
So if I were to ask Brent Badowski, how many families do you think provide nearly half of their early money for efforts to capture the White House, what would you say it is?
I'm not sure it's families only. There are a number of families, but it's also billion-dollar corporations, multi-billion-dollar corporations. It's the big banks, Wall Street firms, pharmaceutical drug companies, insurance companies, all the big boys put together. The problem is not only wealthy individuals. The problem is wealthy companies, wealthy conglomerates. They're not even American or European anymore. They worship the dollar and the Deutsche Frank and the yen. And they don't care about people. They care about profits. And we need to change that.
Yeah, well, I was referring to this New York Times piece here that said 158 families, Brent Badowski, provide nearly half their early money for efforts to capture the White House. And a lot of them are hedge fund managers. One of them that said makes $15 million a month.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And one of them makes $15 million a month.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yes. Simon Dixon, so let's go to the UK. 3 years ago, David Cameron, we had him say that the WEF and the UK would spearhead a global effort to end aggressive, that is, tax avoidance in the UK and in poor countries. And that's one of the things that this Oxfam report has cited, that it needs to be dealt with. But David Cameron's statements was 3 years ago. Whatever happened to that?
Well, they have closed a lot of the loopholes in the UK for people sheltering their assets offshore, and a lot of those have been dealt with. But there's still, if you're rich enough and you want to move your assets offshore, then there's still plenty of ways of doing that. Not all the loopholes have been closed, and unfortunately, due to the different corporate structures and the complexity of corporatism, it's very important to not confuse capitalism failing with corporatism failing here. Capitalism is essentially the small to medium-sized enterprises who are out there, who are providing jobs and having a reverse effect on the inequality divide, versus corporatism, which is using financial engineering, using corporate structure and governance in order to put their assets in the most lucrative places and shelter those assets in the most effective way, but also getting super subsidies through taxpayers' money, through quantitative easing, through central bank systems, through Wall Street, and using all these financial engineering assets and in order to get round whatever policies are put through and whatever legalities. I think David did put through a few policies, but however, you've got to remember that David Cameron is part of that same class out to protect bankers, out to protect the City of London's interest in terms of the financial city and Wall Street.
Very well. I'm glad you mentioned corporatism and capitalism, because I'd like to get back after a quick break when we listen to some of the viewer comments about what John Perkins has cited in his book Economics, or the Confessions of an Economic Hitman 1 and 2. But we'll first listen to some viewer comments and then get back to the topic of the debate.
While in Malawi, 70% of its citizens are struggling a lot even to have breakfast, the world is unfair. Capitalism is the main reason. It creates divisions and discords, resulting in wars, thus selling their main product, weapons. Others too busy in fighting, hence no time for development, so have to buy from capitalists. What do you expect when Americans are able to trade freely while they put economic sanctions on other nations? Liberalism, capitalism, and New World Order plans are in motion.
Okay, those were some of the viewer comments. Bob Dowski, American and New York best-selling author John Perkins talked about what he has called economic hitmen, of which he was one. He advised many of these large corporations, the Fortune 500 corporations. And I don't know if you're a fan of his or not, or if you know about his books. But what he has said is that, and he mentions the United States, and quite clearly, since he was himself an economic hitman, that institutions like the World Bank and the IMF were used by the U.S. In particular to go around having countries become indebted. And then these contracts would be given to these large corporations. And of course, the people involved there at the higher echelons, they're the ones who would be making the money and not the people that are at the bottom of the ladder. Do you think that this, first of all, do you agree with this, what John Perkins is saying, which he obviously says is true? And do you think that's one of the leading causes of income inequality?
Yes, I agree with him. I know his work. I think it's true. And I think what we have right now is not real capitalism. I agree with my colleagues' comments on that. We have some form of corporatism or crony capitalism. If you look at what's going on at Davos right now, and I'm not a big fan of the Davos meetings, you've got wealthy individuals and politicians seeking them, publicly promising to do great things while they privately have meetings in expensive resorts and fancy dinners, making side deals that don't help average men and women. I think the system is rigged from top to bottom. I agree with the Federal Reserve Board. First of all, I'm against raising interest rates right now, period. I think it's a terrible mistake by the Fed. And I was against the way they did the quantitative easing. I agree with my colleague. Most of that money went top down, and it never went down. What they should have done is use that money to rebuild America, roads, bridges, schools, ports, and that would create jobs that would help workers. When all they do is give it to the top, all you have is more speculation, and none of it, to quote Pope Francis, trickles down.
Well, let's break this a little bit further, Simon Dixon, because when we talk about this QE, it's massive. I mean, it started from the year, perhaps you can tell us, 2008 or 9, and it went up to $70 billion a month. It ended recently, but it's not the U.S. that just did that. We also have the European Central Bank. That's about over 2 trillion euros there, and even Japan, their quantitative easing has been massive. Where's all this money going?
So what the quantitative easing money was used for, it was used for 2 reasons. It was firstly used to through the bond market, make large-scale, cheap loans to large corporate institutions. And those large corporate institutions mainly used it in order to buy back their stock, which caused the stock market bubble, which is crashing right now, spurred on by the crash in China, and overvaluing all these stocks because they were taking cheap money that they were able to get from central banks at virtually 0%, buying back stocks, causing a bubble in order to increase and inflate their stock prices and use financial engineering. The other place that it went is it was used to prop up the bank's balance sheet. And that money did not make its way into the economy at all. It was stuck at the central bank's coffers, using it in order to write out and mark to market some of these toxic assets, which caused the problems in the first place. So it was just a complete write-off. Now, you were talking about the IMF and the World Bank and the confessions of an economic hitman. The IMF and World Bank are central banking on a global scale, in which the loans which are created out of thin air, based upon assets which barely exist, which were created by financial engineers in Wall Street and the City of London. And they are used to collateralize loans, make money out of thin air, illegitimate loans to developing countries. And the contracts of those loans to developing countries were that we will issue these loans, which were illegitimate in the first place, based upon you using our supplier, and then that then led them into tied agreements whereby America would benefit, and the end result, once they're over leveraged and they can't afford that, was that the assets need to be stripped.
Okay, and quickly, Brent Badowski, last question. It's very interesting how there are certain places in Middle America where towns that used to have these huge malls, and on Main Street, all the shops are closed. Malls have gone out of business. There's something going on, and I'm using America as an example because you have some actual cities that have gone out of, they're bankrupt. So is the wealth not getting distributed for what reasons where you have these types of scenarios pop up? 30 seconds, please, sorry.
Well, the super wealthy find a way to hire lawyers and lobbyists to make government policy where the wealth basically goes from one group of the rich until another group of the rich. Not going down to the poor who are starving, not going down to the middle class who are suffering. And it's tragic when you see factories and cities close down. We need to get the majority of people to fight for an America and a world economy that's fair to everybody. It won't be given to them. It has to be taken by the people.
Thank you for that. Let me thank our guests. Author of Bank to the Future, Simon Dixon, spoke to us from London. And you were just listening to Brent Badowski, columnist at The Hill, who spoke to us from Washington. Thanks so much for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, Kavitavwe, and the entire team in the capital Tehran, it's goodbye.